Welcome to this profoundly tedious exploration of the experience of visiting a Roman tavern during the evening hours. We will proceed with deliberate slowness through every mundane detail of this activity, examining the sights, sounds, smells, and social dynamics of these establishments with exhaustive attention to the ordinary and unremarkable aspects that made up the actual experience. Prepare yourself for a journey into boredom so complete that sleep will seem like a welcome escape. Chapter 1. The decision to go out. Let us begin not with the tavern itself, but with the decision to visit one, a decision that was often made in the most unremarkable circumstances imaginable. A Roman man, for tavern visitors were predominantly male, would finish his evening meal at home. This meal, called cena, was typically eaten in the late afternoon or early evening, depending on the season and the household schedule. The meal itself was usually simple for most Romans. Bread would be the foundation. This bread was made from wheat or, for poorer households, from barley or other less expensive grains. The bread would be several hours or even a day old by the time it was eaten at cena, as bread was typically baked in batches that would last several days. The texture would be firm, requiring some chewing. The flavour would be plain, as Roman bread was generally made with just flour, water, salt, and leaven. Accompanying the bread might be some vegetables. These could include lentils, beans, cabbage, onions, or turnips, depending on the season and what was available. The vegetables would be boiled in water until soft. Sometimes they would be flavoured with a bit of oil or garum, a fermented fish sauce that was ubiquitous in Roman cooking. The oil would be olive oil, the standard cooking fat in the Mediterranean. The garum would add a salty, savoury flavour that made the bland boiled vegetables more palatable. For those who could afford it, there might be a small amount of meat, cheese, or eggs. These protein sources were more expensive than bread and vegetables and appeared less frequently in ordinary diets. A piece of salted pork, a bit of hard cheese, an egg boiled or fried in oil. These would be occasional additions to the meal rather than daily staples for most people. Wine would accompany the meal. Roman wine was almost always mixed with water. Drinking undiluted wine was considered barbaric and was associated with drunkenness. The proportions varied, but a common ratio was 2 or 3 parts water to 1 part wine. This diluted wine provided calories, some flavour, and was safer to drink than water from uncertain sources, as the alcohol provided some antimicrobial effect. After eating this meal, a Roman man might sit for a while. He might talk with his family if he had one. He might review the next day's business in his mind. He might simply rest, allowing his food to digest, sitting in a chair or on a stool in his home. Roman homes for ordinary people were small, often consisting of just 1 or 2 rooms. The space was used for sleeping, eating, and storing possessions. It was not particularly comfortable or spacious. As the evening wore on, the man might begin to feel restless. The home was cramped. His wife, if he had one, might be busy with domestic tasks, cleaning dishes, preparing items for the next day, tending to children if there were children. The children themselves might be noisy or demanding attention. The small space could feel confining after a day of work. The alternative to staying home was going out. In a Roman city there were limited options for evening entertainment. The baths closed at sunset or shortly before. The forum and shops were closing or had closed. Public games and theatrical performances happened during the day, not at night. For most ordinary Romans, the primary option for evening social activity was the tavern. The decision to go to a tavern was not momentous. It did not require planning or special preparation. A man would simply decide he preferred the atmosphere of the tavern to remaining at home. He might tell his wife he was going out, or he might simply leave. He would not change clothes. He was already wearing his everyday tunic, and there was no expectation of dressing specially for the tavern. He would not bring much with him. Perhaps a small amount of money, a few bronze coins sufficient to purchase wine and possibly some food. The coins would be kept in a small purse worn at his belt, or simply carried loose in the folds of his tunic. He would not need to bring drinking vessels, as the tavern would provide cups. He would not need to bring light, as the streets, though dim, had enough ambient light from buildings and shops to allow navigation, and the tavern itself would be lit. The act of leaving his home and walking through the streets toward the tavern was unremarkable. He would open the door of his home, a wooden door that might creak on its hinges as regular oiling of hinges was often neglected. He would step out into the street. The street would be narrow, paved with large stones that were uneven and sometimes slippery with moisture or accumulated grime. The buildings on either side created a canyon effect, with the structures rising 3 or 4 stories and blocking much of the sky. The evening air would be cooler than the daytime heat, particularly in summer. In winter, it might be cold enough to be uncomfortable, though Rome's Mediterranean climate meant that extreme cold was rare. The air would carry various smells, cooking odours from nearby apartments, the smell of human and animal waste from the street, smoke from lamps and fires, and occasionally more pleasant smells like baking bread if a baker was working late. Other people would be in the streets, though not in great numbers. Evening was not a time when most Romans were out and about. Those who were outside might be returning home from work, heading to taverns like our subject, or engaged in various forms of business or mischief. People did not generally greet strangers in the street, though neighbours who recognized each other might exchange brief words. The walk to the tavern would take varying amounts of time depending on how far away it was. A nearby tavern might be reached in a minute or 2. One across several blocks might require 5 or 10 minutes of walking. The walk itself was boring. The same streets traversed regularly, the same buildings passed repeatedly, the same turns made by habit rather than conscious navigation. The mind might wander during this walk, thinking about the day's events, planning tomorrow's tasks, or simply being blank and unfocused. Chapter 2. Arriving at the tavern. The tavern itself would be identifiable from the street even in the dimming light of evening. Taverns in Rome were called variously tabernae, corponae, or thermopolia, though the distinctions between these terms were not always sharp. They typically occupied ground floor spaces in apartment buildings, opening directly onto the street through a wide doorway or through a fully open front that could be closed with wooden shutters when the establishment was not operating. The visibility of the tavern came partly from light. While streets grew dim after sunset, taverns remained lit with oil lamps. These lamps burned olive oil and produced a warm, yellowish light that spilled out through the open front of the establishment onto the street. This light was not bright by modern standards, equivalent perhaps to a few candles. but in the relative darkness of the evening street, it made the tavern noticeably brighter than surrounding areas. Sound also identified taverns, conversations between patrons, the voice of the tavern keeper calling out to customers or to assistants, the clink of pottery or metal cups, the occasional laugh or raised voice in argument. These sounds carried out into the street. A tavern with multiple patrons would be audibly different from a quiet residential space or a closed shop. As our Roman man approached the tavern, he would have to navigate other people who might be entering, leaving, or standing near the entrance. The area immediately in front of a tavern often accumulated small clusters of people. Some might be customers standing just outside while drinking, particularly if the interior was crowded. Others might be people who had been ejected from the tavern for being too drunk or causing problems. Still others might be individuals who spent their time hanging around taverns without necessarily having money to purchase drinks. Beggars, street vendors, or simply idle people. Entering the tavern required stepping up from the street level in many cases, as the tavern floor was often raised a step or two above the street. This prevented water and debris from the street from easily flowing into the establishment when it rained or when the streets were washed. The doorway itself would be wide enough for two people to pass simultaneously, though if the tavern was busy, there might be a moment of awkward negotiation as people tried to enter and exit at the same time. The immediate sensory impact upon entering would be noticeable. The interior was warmer than the outside, heated by the bodies of patrons, by oil lamps, and sometimes by a brazier used to warm wine or heat food. The air was less fresh than outside. It carried the smell of wine, of the oil burning in lamps, of food if food was being served, and of the unwashed bodies of the patrons. Roman standards of personal hygiene involved bathing regularly, but regularly might mean every few days for many people, and clothes were washed less frequently than bodies, so the accumulated smell of a roomful of people was noticeable. The light inside was dim by modern standards. Multiple oil lamps would be burning, placed on the counter, perhaps on shelves, possibly in wall-mounted holders. These lamps provided enough light to see by but not bright illumination. The light flickered as the oil lamp flames moved in air currents. Shadows would shift and dance on walls. Faces would be partially lit, features visible but details obscured in the uncertain light. The visual layout of the tavern would become apparent as the entering patron's eyes adjusted to the interior lighting. The most prominent feature was the counter or bar. This was typically an L-shaped or U-shaped masonry structure faced with marble or tile, and containing large ceramic vessels called dolia. These dolia were embedded in the counter and held wine, water, and possibly other beverages. The counter surface provided space for customers to lean while drinking, and for the tavern keeper to prepare drinks. Behind the counter would be the tavern keeper himself, or sometimes a slave or family member who was working on the keeper's behalf. This person would be positioned to access the dolia in the counter, to reach shelves on the wall behind where cups and other items were stored, and to take money from customers. The tavern keeper would typically be standing, though if business was slow, he might sit on a stool. The rest of the tavern's interior would contain various pieces of furniture, though less than a modern person might expect. There might be a few small tables, wooden tables, simple in construction, standing on 3 or 4 legs. Around these tables might be stools or benches. However, many taverns had minimal seating. Customers were expected to stand at the counter or to lean against walls. This arrangement allowed more customers to fit in a small space and reduced the tavern keeper's investment in furniture that would eventually wear out or be damaged. The walls would be plastered and possibly painted, though the paint in a lower-class establishment would be simple. Perhaps a single colour, perhaps a basic pattern or stripe. Wealthy establishments might have more elaborate wall paintings depicting scenes from mythology, landscapes or decorative motifs, but most taverns serving ordinary customers had plain walls or very simple decoration. The walls might also bear graffiti, scratched or painted messages left by previous customers, ranging from names to crude drawings to brief statements or insults. The floor would be of beaten earth, concrete, or simple tile, depending on the quality of the establishment. It would not be clean by modern standards. Spilled wine, dropped food, and various other debris would accumulate during the day and evening. Some tavern keepers would sweep floors periodically, but this was not constant. The floor might be slightly sticky underfoot from spilled wine that had dried into a residue. Small items dropped by customers might be lying scattered. Coins too small to bother retrieving, bits of food, broken pottery fragments. Chapter 3. Ordering a drink. Having entered the tavern and surveyed the scene, our Roman customer would need to obtain a drink. This process was straightforward but not instantaneous. He would first need to position himself where the tavern keeper could see him and where he could communicate his order. If the tavern was busy, this might require waiting briefly or catching the keeper's attention with a gesture or word. The tavern keeper's attention would be divided between multiple tasks. He might be serving another customer. He might be refilling one of the dolia from an amphora of wine stored in the back room. He might be collecting payment from someone. He might be engaged in conversation with a regular customer. The etiquette of the situation was that customers waited their turn without excessive impatience, though some jostling for position and attempts to gain attention were normal. Once the tavern keeper acknowledged our customer, the ordering would be simple. Wine, the customer might say. No elaborate menu existed. The choices were limited. Wine was the primary beverage. Water was available, but was generally not ordered alone. It was for mixing with wine. Some taverns might offer a few other options. Posca, a mixture of wine, water and vinegar that was cheap and refreshing. Mulsum, wine mixed with honey. Or calda, wine mixed with water and heated. But most customers ordered simply wine without specification. The tavern keeper would reach for a cup. These cups were typically ceramic, pottery of various qualities ranging from rough, thick earthenware to finer, thinner vessels. The cup would hold perhaps 1/4 to 1/3 of a litre. It would not be washed between customers in the modern sense. The keeper might rinse it quickly with water, or might pour wine into a cup that had just been used by another customer without any cleaning. Hygiene standards were different than modern expectations. The alcohol in the wine provided some antimicrobial effect, and people did not associate unwashed cups with disease transmission. The keeper would dip a ladle into one of the dolia in the counter. The ladle would be metal, bronze or iron, or ceramic. He would fill the cup with wine from the ladle, possibly adding water from another dolium if the customer wanted his wine diluted, or leaving it undiluted if the customer preferred. The proportions were not measured precisely. The keeper would estimate based on experience and the customer's stated preference. The wine itself would be red or white, though red was more common. Roman wine was made from grapes that grew extensively throughout Italy and the broader Mediterranean world. The winemaking process resulted in a product that was often more acidic and less sweet than modern wines. The wine might be from the current year's harvest or from previous years. It might be of good quality or poor quality, depending on the establishment and what the customer was willing to pay. The price would be stated by the tavern keeper. Prices varied by establishment, by wine quality, and by the size of serving. A basic cup of wine might cost 1 or 2 asses, small bronze coins. Better wine might cost more. The customer would need to produce payment, fishing coins from his purse or from the folds of his tunic where he had tucked them. He would hand the coins to the keeper, who would examine them briefly to ensure they were genuine and of proper weight, then set them aside in a money box or container. With payment made, the customer now possessed his cup of wine. He would need to decide where to stand or sit while drinking it. If the tavern had tables with available seats, he might move to one, though this required navigating through other patrons without spilling his drink. If seating was unavailable or undesired, he might remain at the counter, or move to lean against a wall, or stand in whatever open space he could find. The first sip of wine would be unremarkable. The wine would be at room temperature unless it had been heated, which was uncommon except in cold weather. The taste would be acidic with varying levels of fruitiness depending on the wine's quality and age. If the wine was poorly made or had begun to turn to vinegar, the taste might be quite sour. If the wine was good, it would have pleasant fruit flavours, though nothing like the complex wines that modern connoisseurs expect. The wine would not be consumed quickly. A cup of wine was meant to last for a period of time, perhaps 20 minutes to half an hour or more. The customer would sip occasionally, allowing time between sips for conversation, for observing other patrons, for thinking, or simply for standing and existing in the space. Drinking was not purely about consuming alcohol, but was a social activity that provided structure for spending time. The effect of the wine would be gradual. The alcohol content of Roman wine was probably similar to modern wine, perhaps 10 to 15% alcohol by volume before dilution. When mixed with water, the alcohol percentage would be lower, perhaps 5 to 8%. Drinking 1 cup of this diluted wine would produce mild relaxation without significant intoxication for most people. The warmth in the stomach, the slight mental loosening, the feeling of relaxation, these subtle effects were part of the appeal of visiting the tavern. If the customer wanted more wine after finishing his first cup, the process would repeat. Return to the counter, gain the keeper's attention, order another cup, pay for it, receive it, find a place to stand or sit, drink it slowly. Some customers would have 2 or 3 cups over the course of an evening. Others might have more, drinking to the point of obvious intoxication, though this was looked down upon by the respectable as a sign of lack of self-control. Chapter 4. The other patrons. While drinking, our customer would be surrounded by other patrons of the tavern. These individuals would vary in their backgrounds, occupations, and reasons for being there, but they would share the common characteristic of being ordinary people rather than the social elite. Roman taverns were not establishments frequented by senators or wealthy merchants. They were spaces for common people, labourers, craftsmen, shopkeepers, slaves sent on errands by their masters, freedmen, soldiers when off duty, and various other members of the lower social orders. The number of patrons would vary by time of evening and day of week. Early evening might be relatively quiet, with only a handful of customers. As evening progressed, more people would arrive. By the middle of the evening, a popular tavern might have 20 or 30 people present, though they would not all arrive simultaneously or stay for the same duration. People would trickle in, spend some time, and leave, creating a constantly changing mix of who was present. The patrons nearest to our customer would be the most noticeable. To his left might stand a man of perhaps 40 years wearing a tunic that showed signs of hard wear, stained, frayed at the hem, patched in a few places. This man might be a labourer, someone who worked with his hands at jobs that wore out clothing quickly. He might stand leaning against the counter, cup of wine in hand, occasionally taking a sip, his attention focused on his own thoughts or on a conversation with another nearby patron. To the right might be a younger man, perhaps in his 20s, with the muscular build of someone who did physical work. He might be drinking more quickly than the older man, showing more enthusiasm for the wine and for being in the social environment of the tavern. He might be more vocal, more likely to make comments to others or to laugh at something said by someone else. At a table in the corner might sit two men engaged in conversation. Their voices would carry across the room in fragments, individual words and phrases audible, but the complete conversation unclear unless one stood very close. They might be discussing work, complaining about a supervisor or customer, talking about mutual acquaintances, or simply passing the time with rambling conversation that had no particular point or direction. Near the door might stand a slave, identifiable by his clothing or demeanour, sent by his master to purchase wine to bring back to the household. The slave would be waiting for the tavern keeper to fill an amphora or jug with wine from one of the dolia. The slave would look slightly uncomfortable, aware that he was in the tavern on business rather than for his own pleasure, expected to complete his errand and return without lingering. The demographic composition of the tavern would be overwhelmingly male. Roman social norms held that taverns were not appropriate places for respectable women. Women who appeared in taverns were generally assumed to be prostitutes, or were the tavern keeper's wife or daughters who worked in the establishment. The absence of women except in these specific roles was so normal that it went unremarked. A tavern full of men drinking together was the expected situation. The ages would range from young men in their late teens or early 20s, up to older men in their 50s or even 60s. Very young people would not be present. Tavern drinking was an adult activity. Very old people would be rare simply because life expectancy meant that few people reached advanced age, and those who did were less likely to be out at taverns in the evening. The clothing would be uniformly simple. All would be wearing tunics, the standard Roman garment for men of the lower classes. These tunics were essentially knee-length shirts, made of wool or linen, usually undyed or in a natural brownish colour, sometimes in other colours if the wearer had paid for dyed fabric. The tunics would be worn belted at the waist with a simple cord or leather belt. Under the tunics, some men might wear loincloths, others might wear nothing. Over the tunics, if the weather was cool, some might wear cloaks or wraps. The footwear would consist mostly of sandals or simple leather shoes. Some patrons might be barefoot, particularly if they were very poor or if they had simply not bothered with footwear for a short walk to a nearby tavern. Roman sandals were basic. Leather soles attached to the foot with leather straps. They provided protection from rough pavement but were not designed for comfort or support in the modern sense. The general grooming and cleanliness would be variable. Some patrons would have bathed that day at the public baths and would be relatively clean. Others might have bathed days earlier and would carry the smell of accumulated sweat and grime. Hair would generally be short on men. Long hair was considered barbaric or effeminate. Most men would be clean-shaven or nearly so, as beards were not fashionable during most of the Roman imperial period. However, some men might have stubble from not shaving for a day or two. The interactions between patrons would be generally cordial, though not necessarily friendly. Strangers might stand near each other without speaking, each focused on his own drink and thoughts. Acquaintances who recognized each other might exchange greetings and fall into conversation. Friends who had arranged to meet might sit together at a table and talk for extended periods, but aggressive or hostile interactions would be relatively uncommon during the early to middle part of the evening, when people were still relatively sober. Chapter 5. The Atmosphere and Ambience. The overall atmosphere of the tavern would be shaped by multiple sensory inputs working together to create a specific environmental experience. This atmosphere was familiar to regular patrons, unremarkable in its familiarity, yet distinctive enough that entering the tavern was noticeably different from being on the street or at home. The sound environment was layered with multiple simultaneous sources. The primary sounds were human, voices, conversations between pairs or small groups of patrons, occasional louder exclamations or laughs, the tavern keeper calling out to customers or to assistants. These voices would create a general hum of sound that filled the space. Individual words would be difficult to distinguish unless the speaker was very close or speaking very loudly. The acoustic quality of the space, plastered walls, a hard floor, no sound-absorbing materials, meant that sounds echoed and overlapped, creating a reverberant environment where every noise contributed to the overall sonic texture. Beneath the voices, other sounds contributed to the soundscape. The scrape of pottery cups being set down on wooden tables or stone counters. The clink of coins being counted or dropped into money boxes. The footsteps of patrons moving through the space. Footfalls on the floor, sometimes barely audible, sometimes heavier and more noticeable. The sound of wine being poured from ladle into cup, a liquid sound that was brief but distinct. Occasionally the sound of something being dropped, a cup hitting the floor, coins scattering. The visual environment was dominated by the warm, flickering light of oil lamps. These lamps produced light through the combustion of olive oil, drawn up through a wick. The flames were small, perhaps 1/2 inch to an inch high, and they moved constantly with any air current. This movement meant that the light in the tavern was never steady. Shadows shifted continuously. Faces would be alternatively more and less visible as lamp flames grew brighter or dimmer. The quality of light was yellow-orange, quite different from the blue-white light of modern electric lighting. The surfaces visible in this light would be mostly earth-toned. The plastered walls might be white or cream-coloured, or painted in reds, yellows or browns, pigments that were common and relatively inexpensive. The wooden tables and stools would show the natural brown colour of wood, darkened by age, wear, and accumulated grime. The ceramic cups would be reddish-brown or tan, the natural colours of fired clay. The wine in the cups would be red or golden, depending on the wine's type. The overall visual palette was warm but not particularly bright or colourful. The olfactory environment was complex and not entirely pleasant by modern standards. The dominant smell was wine, not the subtle bouquet that wine connoisseurs appreciate, but the stronger, more acidic smell of wine that has been sitting in open containers, exposed to air at room temperature. This wine smell permeated the space, absorbed into the walls, the floor, the furniture. It was the characteristic smell of the tavern, identifiable even from outside. Mixed with the wine smell was the odour of burning olive oil from the lamps. This was a greasy, slightly acrid smell, not offensive but noticeable. The oil would occasionally smoke if a wick was poorly trimmed, adding a smokier note to the atmosphere. The accumulated smoke from lamps would deposit soot on the ceiling and upper walls, creating dark stains that characterized any space lit by oil lamps. The smell of human bodies was also present, the collective odour of 20 or 30 men who had worked during the day, some of whom had bathed recently and some of whom had not. This smell combined sweat, the oil or perfume that some men might apply to their bodies after bathing, the wool or linen of their tunics which retained body odour, and the general smell of skin and hair. The smell was not typically strong enough to be offensive unless a particular individual had exceptionally poor hygiene, but it formed part of the background odour environment. If food was being served, additional smells would be present. Bread, if freshly baked or heated, would add a pleasant yeasty aroma. Cooked vegetables would contribute their own scents. Boiled cabbage, fried onions, lentils simmering in a pot. Garum, if used in cooking, added a fishy, salty smell. Olive oil, when heated for cooking, produced a distinctive scent. These food smells would be localized near wherever food was being prepared, but would drift through the tavern space to some degree. The temperature inside the tavern would be warmer than the outside air, particularly as the evening progressed and more patrons crowded into the space. Each human body produces heat, and 20 or 30 bodies in a relatively small space would raise the temperature noticeably. The oil lamps also produced heat, though their contribution was minor compared to the bodies. In summer, this additional warmth might make the tavern uncomfortably hot. In winter, it would be welcome. The air quality would decline as the evening wore on. With many people breathing in a closed space, the oxygen level would gradually decrease, and the carbon dioxide level would increase. This would not reach dangerous levels, but would contribute to a feeling of stuffiness. The smoke from oil lamps, though not heavy, would accumulate. The lack of good ventilation. Taverns typically had only the front opening and perhaps a small window or vent, meant that air did not circulate well. The overall effect was an atmosphere that felt used, warm, and somewhat stale. Chapter 6. Conversation and social interaction. Conversation was a primary activity in the tavern, though the content of these conversations was typically mundane rather than profound. People talked about ordinary matters, work, weather, mutual acquaintances, local events, complaints about various aspects of life. The conversations followed patterns that would be familiar to anyone who has listened to small talk in any era. A typical conversation might begin with a simple greeting between two acquaintances who encountered each other at the tavern. "Greetings," one might say. "Greetings," the other would respond. This exchange, while perfunctory, established that the two men recognized each other and were willing to interact. What followed would depend on their relationship and their inclination to talk. If they were casual acquaintances, the conversation might not develop much beyond the initial greeting and perhaps a comment about the weather or the wine. "Hot today," one might observe. "Yes, very hot," the other might agree. This exchange acknowledged shared experience without requiring much thought or investment. It fulfilled social expectations of civil interaction without imposing demands for extended conversation. If they were better acquainted or more inclined toward conversation, the exchange would develop further. One might ask about the other's work. "How is business?" he might inquire. The response would typically be moderate. "About the same," or "could be better," were common answers. Romans were generally not effusively positive in response to such questions. Complaining mildly about business or work conditions was expected. To claim that everything was wonderful might invite envy or seem like boasting. The complaining would continue in a desultory manner. "The prices for materials keep rising," one might say. "Yes, everything costs more," the other would agree. They might exchange specific examples of price increases they had noticed. "Olive oil is twice what it cost last year." "Pottery is the same. The potters are raising their prices." This sharing of economic grievances was a bonding activity. Everyone faced rising costs. Everyone struggled to make ends meet, and acknowledging this shared struggle created a sense of community. Politics might be discussed, though in careful terms. The Roman Empire during the imperial period was autocratic, and criticism of the emperor or imperial policy could be dangerous. Tavern conversation about politics therefore tended to focus on local matters: corrupt officials, unfair tax collection, incompetent administrators. These complaints were safe because they targeted individuals without questioning the system itself. The idealism. "Lazy," someone might observe. "Yes, the streets are never cleaned," another would agree. This kind of talk allowed expression of frustration without crossing into dangerous territory. Sports and entertainment were safe topics that generated more enthusiasm. The chariot races at the Circus Maximus were particularly popular subjects. Roman men often had strong allegiances to the different racing factions: the blues, greens, reds, and whites. Discussions about recent races, the performance of particular charioteers, and predictions about upcoming races could become quite animated. "The Greens will win the next race," one man might assert. "No, the Blues have the better horses," another would counter. This argument could continue at length without resolution, as it was based on subjective judgments and predictions about uncertain future events. Gladiatorial games also generated conversation. Recent contests would be described in detail. Did you see the Thracian fighter in yesterday's games? Yes, he was skilled with the curved sword. The discussion might reconstruct the fight, with each participant offering his observations about tactics, mistakes, moments of particular skill or courage. This topic combined the appeal of athletic competition with the visceral interest of combat and blood. Personal matters were discussed with varying degrees of openness depending on the relationship between the speakers. A man might complain about his wife, though this complaining followed conventional patterns. Wives were accused of spending too much money, nagging too much, or being overly demanding. These complaints were ritualized, expected expressions of masculine frustration, with domestic life rather than serious grievances that would lead to action. Other men would sympathize and share similar complaints about their own wives. This mutual commiseration reinforced male solidarity and provided an outlet for domestic tensions. Children were another topic, discussed with a mixture of affection and frustration. Sons were hopes for the future, but were also expensive to raise and could be disappointing in their behavior or choices. Daughters were beloved, but were also financial burdens requiring dowries. The conversation about children would weave between pride in their accomplishments and worry about their futures. Gossip about neighbours and acquaintances circulated constantly. Who was having an affair, who was in financial trouble, who had gotten into a fight, who had been seen drunk in public. All these matters were discussed with great interest. The gossip served multiple functions. It was entertaining, filling conversational time with stories. It reinforced social norms by allowing collective judgment of those who violated expectations. It created and maintained social bonds through shared knowledge of the community. Some conversations would drift into storytelling. Men who had served in the military might tell stories about their service, campaigns they had participated in, places they had travelled, experiences they had endured. These stories would be embellished with retelling, growing more dramatic and exciting with each iteration. The listeners would hear them with varying degrees of belief, knowing that veteran soldiers always exaggerated but finding the stories entertaining regardless. Arguments would occasionally develop from conversations. A disagreement about the chariot races might become heated. An insult intended as a joke might be taken seriously. A political discussion might reveal opposing viewpoints that led to angry exchanges. These arguments rarely resulted in physical violence during the early evening, when patrons were still relatively sober, but they would create tension and might lead to raised voices, aggressive posturing, and intervention by the tavern keeper or other patrons to calm things down. Chapter 7. Food in the Tavern. While wine was the primary offering of Roman taverns, many also served food. The food available was simple and inexpensive, suited to the clientele who were generally working people without much money to spend on elaborate meals. The food served in taverns was not meant to be the main meal of the day, but rather was snacks or light fare to accompany drinking. The most common food item would be bread. This might be the same type of bread that people ate at home, loaves of wheat or barley bread, baked earlier in the day or the previous day, sold by the piece or by weight. The bread would be dense and chewy, requiring effort to tear and chew. It could be eaten plain or dipped in wine to soften it. The price would be minimal, perhaps 1 as for a piece sufficient for one person. Olives were another common offering. Roman Italy produced olives extensively, and they were an inexpensive food that could be stored without special preservation for some time. The olive served in taverns would be the whole fruit, possibly still, containing the pit. They might be served in small bowls placed on the counter, or tables where patrons could help themselves, or they might be sold in small portions. The olives would be salty, they were preserved in brine, and eating them would create thirst that would encourage the purchase of more wine. Cheese might be available, though it was more expensive than bread or olives. Roman cheese was typically hard cheese made from sheep or goat milk, aged until it was firm enough to grate or cut into pieces. The cheese would be salty and sharp in flavour. It might be eaten in chunks, grated over bread, or consumed as an accompaniment to wine. A serving of cheese might cost several asses, making it a more significant expenditure than bread. Some taverns offered hot food, prepared in a small kitchen area or over a brazier. Stews were common. Lentils, beans, or chickpeas cooked with water, oil, and garum until soft. These stews would be served in bowls, possibly with bread for dipping, or soaking up the liquid. The temperature would be warm rather than hot, as the stew might have been sitting for hours since preparation. The flavour would be simple. The taste of the legumes themselves, salt from the garum, possibly some herbs if the cook was more ambitious. Sausages might be available in some taverns. These would be made from pork or other meats, mixed with spices and stuffed into intestine casings, then cooked by boiling, roasting or grilling. The sausages would be sold by the piece. They would be lukewarm rather than hot if they had been cooked earlier. The flavour would be salty and fatty, with whatever spice blend the sausage maker had used. Eating a sausage would be a greasy experience, leaving oil on the fingers that would need to be wiped on clothing or a cloth. Some establishments offered fried foods. Small fish might be fried in olive oil and served whole. Vegetables could be cut and fried. These fried items would be served on simple plates or in bowls. The grease from frying would coat them, making them rich and heavy. This richness was appealing after a day of plain food, though it might sit heavily in the stomach. The preparation of food in the tavern kitchen, if visible or audible to patrons, would add to the sensory environment. The sound of food being stirred in pots, the sizzle of items being fried, the clang of metal utensils against ceramic containers, all would be background noise. The smells of cooking, onions frying, bread toasting, meat roasting, would waft through the space, sometimes appetizing, sometimes less so depending on what was being prepared and how skilled the cook was. Eating in the tavern was a casual affair. There were no napkins. Greasy fingers would be wiped on one's tunic or on the edge of the table. Bones, olive pits, or other inedible portions would be dropped on the floor or into containers set out for such waste. Table manners in the modern sense did not really exist. Eating was functional. Getting food from the serving vessel or one's hand into one's mouth with reasonable efficiency. The social niceties around eating were minimal compared to formal dining in elite households. The quality of tavern food was variable. Some establishments had reasonably good cooks who produced flavourful, well-prepared food. Others had indifferent cooks whose products were barely palatable. The customers, being primarily working people accustomed to simple food, were not particularly demanding. As long as the food was edible and inexpensive, it served its purpose of providing something to eat while drinking. The food was not meant to be memorable or exceptional, just adequate. Health regulations regarding food preparation and service did not exist in the modern sense. Food might sit at room temperature for hours. It might be handled by people who had not washed their hands. Fleas might land on it. The water used in preparation might not be clean. The utensils and containers might not be thoroughly washed between uses. These conditions were normal and went unquestioned. People occasionally got sick from bad food, but the connection between food handling practices and illness was not understood, so no systematic efforts were made to improve hygiene. Chapter 8. Games and Entertainment. While drinking and conversation were the primary activities in Roman taverns, some establishments offered additional entertainment or diversions to attract and retain customers. These entertainments were generally simple, requiring minimal equipment or setup, and were conducted informally rather than as organized events. Dice games were common and popular. Roman dice were similar to modern six-sided dice, made from bone, ivory or wood, with dots indicating the numbers 1 through 6. The games played with these dice range from simple gambling games, where players bet on the outcome of rolls, to more complex games that involved strategy and multiple rounds of play. The specific rules varied by region and by the preferences of the players. A typical dice game session would begin with 2 or more men agreeing to play. They would establish what they were playing for. Money was most common, with players contributing coins to a pot that would be won by the victor. The stakes might be modest, a few asses per player, or more substantial if the players were feeling bold or were already somewhat drunk and making poor decisions about risking their money. The players would find a flat surface for rolling dice, a table if one was available, or a smooth section of floor, or the bar counter if the tavern keeper permitted it. One player would roll first, shaking the dice in his hand and casting them onto the surface. The dice would tumble and come to rest showing various combinations of numbers. The interpretation of these numbers would depend on the specific game being played. Some games required certain combinations to win. Others involved achieving the highest or lowest total. Still others had more complex scoring systems. The other players would then take their turns rolling. The process would repeat through multiple rounds until a winner was determined according to the game's rules. The winner would collect the pot of money that had been wagered. Arguments about whether someone had cheated, whether a roll was valid, or whether the rules had been correctly applied were common. These arguments would sometimes be resolved by appealing to other patrons who had been watching, or by the tavern keeper intervening to maintain peace, or simply by one side conceding to avoid further conflict. Board games were played in some taverns. The Romans played various board games, including Ludus Latrunculorum, a game somewhat like checkers, and others whose rules have been lost to history. These games required a board, which might be scratched into a table surface or drawn on a portable board that players brought with them, and playing pieces. which could be anything from dedicated game pieces to improvised markers like pebbles or coins. A board game session would be more prolonged than dice games. The players would sit across from each other at a table, the board between them. They would take turns moving pieces according to the game's rules. This would continue for perhaps half an hour or more until one player won. Spectators might gather to watch, offering commentary or advice, though such interference was not always welcome from the players who wanted to concentrate on their game. Music was occasionally present in taverns, though it was not as ubiquitous as in modern bars. A patron who knew how to play a simple instrument might bring it and play informally. The Roman instruments that would appear in tavern contexts included flutes, small drums and lyres. The music played would be popular tunes, songs that everyone knew, rhythmic pieces suited to the informal atmosphere. The quality of tavern music would generally be mediocre. The players were not professional musicians, but amateurs playing for their own or others' entertainment. The instruments might be poorly made or poorly maintained. The acoustics of the space were not ideal for music. The hard surfaces created echo and reverberation that muddied the sound. But in a context where people were drinking, and the music was background rather than the focus of attention, these deficiencies did not matter much. Singing might break out spontaneously. A patron who had drunk enough to feel uninhibited might start singing a popular song. Others who knew the song might join in. The singing would be off-key and badly coordinated, but in the fellowship of the tavern, this was acceptable. The songs would be work songs, military marching songs, bawdy songs with crude lyrics, or sentimental songs about love or loss. The lyrics would be familiar enough that many patrons could join in on the chorus, even if they did not know all the verses. Storytelling could be a form of entertainment. A patron with a talent for narration might hold forth with a story, a myth, a legend, a historical anecdote, a joke. The other patrons would listen with varying degrees of attention. If the storyteller was skilled and the story engaging, he might hold the attention of a significant portion of the tavern. If less skilled, only those immediately nearby might listen, and even they might drift away if the story dragged on too long. Physical contests occasionally occurred. Arm wrestling between two men testing their strength was simple and required no equipment. One man would challenge another. They would clasp hands with elbows on a table, and they would try to force the other's arm down. The contest would be over in seconds, or might last minutes if the two were evenly matched. Spectators would gather around shouting encouragement or mockery, sometimes placing small bets on the outcome. Sexual services were sometimes available in or near taverns. Prostitutes, both female and male, might work in taverns or in rooms adjacent to or above them. A patron interested in such services would negotiate directly with the prostitute, or with the tavern keeper who might act as a go-between. The transaction would be brief and businesslike. The services would be performed in a back room or upstairs room quickly and without romance or pretense. This aspect of tavern life was considered normal if slightly disreputable. It was not hidden or shameful, just one of the services that could be purchased. Chapter 9. The progression of the evening. As the evening wore on, the character of the tavern would gradually change. What had started as a relatively quiet establishment with a few customers drinking and talking would evolve into a louder, more crowded and less inhibited environment as more patrons arrived and as the effects of alcohol accumulated. The early evening period just after sunset would be the calmest time. The first patrons to arrive would be those who lived very nearby and who had come out soon after finishing their evening meals. These early arrivals would be relative few, perhaps 5 or 6 people in a tavern that could hold 30. They would space themselves out in the available space, not crowding together. The conversations would be quiet. The tavern keeper would be unhurried in serving customers. The overall atmosphere would be almost subdued. As time passed, more patrons would arrive. By the second hour after sunset, the number might have doubled or tripled. The additional bodies would make the space feel more crowded. Patrons would stand closer together. Conversations would need to be louder to be heard over the general noise level, which would itself increase as more voices contributed to the ambient sound. The tavern keeper would be busier, moving more quickly between customers, spending less time on individual interactions. The customers arriving later would often be in a more festive mood than the early arrivals. They had perhaps spent time at home building up their enthusiasm for going out, or they had finished work later and were more eager to relax. They might arrive in pairs or small groups of friends who had arranged to meet at the tavern. These groups would be more animated than solitary drinkers, laughing more readily, talking more loudly, moving around more actively. The consumption of wine would accelerate as the evening progressed. Patrons who had nursed a single cup during the first hour might switch to drinking more rapidly. The social environment encouraged drinking. Seeing others drink prompted one to drink as well. The warmth and noise of the increasingly crowded space made wine seem more appealing as a way to enhance the sense of relaxation and social connection. The effects of increased alcohol consumption would become noticeable. Voices would get louder as people spoke with less restraint. Laughter would become more frequent and more boisterous. Inhibitions would lower, leading to more frank or crude comments that would have been suppressed when sober. Physical coordination would decline slightly, leading to clumsier movements, drinks being spilled more frequently, people bumping into each other more often. Arguments would become more likely as the evening advanced and patrons became more intoxicated. A comment that would have been ignored or laughed off earlier might provoke anger. A disagreement about something trivial might escalate into a heated exchange. The lowered inhibitions and reduced judgment that came with drinking meant that people were more likely to say offensive things and more likely to take offence at what was said to them. The tavern keeper would need to manage these increasing tensions. If an argument seemed likely to become a physical fight, he would intervene, stepping between the arguing parties, telling them to calm down, possibly threatening to eject them from the tavern if they did not control themselves. His authority in his own establishment was generally respected, though very drunk patrons might ignore him and require physical removal. Actual violence in taverns was probably less common than popular imagination suggests. Most Roman men were not looking for fights. They wanted to drink, socialize, and relax. Fighting meant potential injury, damage to clothing, possible legal trouble, and ejection from the tavern. Most arguments would be resolved through talking, posturing, and backing down without blows being exchanged. but occasionally fights did occur. A punch thrown, a wrestling match, broken cups and overturned tables. When fights did occur, they would be stopped relatively quickly. Other patrons would pull the fighters apart, not necessarily out of concern for the fighters, but because the fight disrupted everyone's evening and might bring unwanted attention from authorities. The tavern keeper would eject the fighters, pushing them out the door and telling them not to return that night. The disrupted furniture would be set right. The broken pottery would be swept up. The tavern would return to its normal state within minutes. Sexual activity would become more visible as the evening progressed and inhibitions lowered. The prostitutes working in or near the tavern would be more active. Men who would not have approached them earlier in the evening might do so after drinking. The negotiations and transactions would be more open and less discreet. Couples might be seen heading to back rooms, returning sometime later. This activity was noticed but not remarked upon. It was expected behaviour in the tavern environment. By late evening, perhaps 3 or 4 hours after sunset, the tavern would be at its most crowded and most chaotic. The air would be thick with smoke and smells. The noise level would be high. Many conversations all happening simultaneously. Shouts and laughter, perhaps singing. The floor would be sticky with lore, spilled wine and littered with debris. Many patrons would be noticeably drunk, swaying, slurring their words, being overly affectionate or aggressive. Chapter 10. Departure and aftermath. Eventually our Roman customer would decide to leave the tavern and return home. This decision might be prompted by various factors. He might have spent all the money he had brought with him. He might have drunk enough wine to feel satisfied without wanting to drink more. He might be tired and ready to sleep. He might have work early the next morning and a sense of responsibility about getting adequate rest. The physical act of leaving would require navigating through the crowded space to the door. This navigation would be more difficult if the patron was drunk. His balance would be worse, his spatial judgment impaired. He might bump into other patrons or furniture. He might stumble or need to steady himself against a wall. Other patrons would not be particularly helpful or sympathetic. They might shove him aside if he blocked their way, or make mocking comments about his unsteady gait. Emerging from the tavern into the street would be a sudden environmental transition. The noisy, warm, bright interior would give way to the quiet, cool, dark street. The contrast would be striking. The patron's eyes would need to adjust from the lamplight to the darkness. His ears would ring slightly from the hours of noise. The cooler air would feel refreshing initially, but might become uncomfortable if the night was cold and he had no cloak. The nighttime street would be very different from the daytime street. Most buildings would be dark, their occupants asleep or preparing for sleep. The street would be nearly empty of people. Only occasional other individuals would be visible, also heading home from taverns or other nighttime activities. The darkness would be significant. There was no street lighting. The moon, if it was out and not obscured by clouds, would provide some illumination, but this would be minimal and uncertain. Navigating the streets at night required care. The uneven paving stones that were merely inconvenient during the day became hazardous in darkness. A patron whose balance was already compromised by alcohol would need to walk slowly and carefully to avoid tripping. The narrow streets, with buildings close on either side, would be even darker than wider streets where moonlight might penetrate. A wrong turn could lead to getting lost, though most residents knew their neighbourhoods well enough to navigate even in darkness. The nighttime streets had certain dangers. Robbery was a possibility. Thieves knew that people returning from taverns might have money and would be less alert and capable of defending themselves. The darkness provided cover for criminals. A sensible person walking home at night would be aware of his surroundings, would avoid the darkest alleys, and would walk quickly once reaching more isolated areas. Our patron, if drunk, might be less cautious and therefore more vulnerable. Other dangers included aggressive drunks who might pick fights, wild dogs that roamed the streets at night, and chamber pots being emptied from upper-story windows onto the street below. The latter was a real hazard. Apartment dwellers often simply threw wastewater and chamber pot contents out their windows at night, rather than carrying them downstairs. A person walking below at the wrong moment might be drenched with foul liquid. This was considered bad luck and was unpleasant, but it was an accepted risk of nighttime travel. The walk home would take the same amount of time as the walk to the tavern, though it might feel longer to a tired and drunk patron. The streets would be quieter. The sounds would be his own footsteps echoing off buildings, perhaps a dog barking in the distance, perhaps voices from a window where people were still awake. The smells would be different than daytime. Cooler air meant some smells were less intense, but the smell of waste and garbage that accumulated in streets would still be present. Arriving home, the patron would need to enter his dwelling. If he lived in a ground floor apartment or room, this would be straightforward. Open the door and enter. If he lived on an upper floor of an insular apartment building, he would need to climb stairs. These stairs would be dark. No lighting would be provided in common areas. Climbing stairs while drunk in complete darkness required careful attention to footing to avoid falling. Entering his home, the patron would need to do so quietly if family members were sleeping, though this was not always possible for a drunk person. He might stumble, make noise, wake his wife if he had one. She might scold him for being late, for spending money on wine, for coming home drunk. This scolding would be delivered in whispers to avoid waking children. The patron might respond defensively, or might simply endure it silently, being too tired and drunk to argue. The process of preparing for sleep would be minimal. He might remove his belt and sandals, but would likely sleep in his tunic. Roman sleeping arrangements for ordinary people were simple. A mattress stuffed with straw or other materials, placed directly on the floor or on a simple wooden frame. Blankets or cloaks would provide warmth if the night was cold. Multiple people might share a sleeping space. Husband and wife, sometimes children as well. Privacy was minimal. Lying down after an evening of drinking would bring physical sensations that were sometimes unpleasant. The room might seem to spin slightly, a common effect of alcohol consumption. The patron might feel nausea if he had drunk too much. He might have a headache beginning already, though the full effects of a hangover would not be felt until morning. Thirst was common. The wine and salty tavern food would leave him dehydrated. Sleep would come eventually despite the discomfort. The alcohol in his system would act as a sedative, making falling asleep easier even if the quality of sleep would be poor. The patron would drift off, his mind perhaps briefly reviewing the evening's events, the people he had talked to, the wine he had drunk, the money he had spent, before consciousness faded entirely. The morning after would bring its own discomforts. Waking with a headache, dry mouth, and feeling poorly rested was the predictable consequence of an evening of drinking at the tavern. The patron would need to rouse himself regardless of how he felt, as work would not wait for his recovery. He would drink water to ease his thirst, eat something bland if he could stomach it, and begin another day. The evening at the tavern would fade into memory, not particularly notable, just one of many similar evenings that blurred together in the routine of ordinary life. Chapter 11. The Tavern Keeper's Perspective. While we have examined the experience from a customer's viewpoint, the tavern keeper's perspective offers another dimension to understanding these establishments. The keeper's experience was one of constant work, management of diverse challenges, and navigation of the social and economic complexities of running what was essentially a small business in the Roman world. The tavern keeper's day would begin earlier than his customers' evenings. He would need to prepare the establishment for the day's business. This preparation involved multiple tasks that were repetitive and time-consuming. The first task would be opening the shutters or doors that had been closed overnight to secure the premises. These wooden shutters would be heavy and would require physical effort to remove and store. Once the tavern was open to the street, the keeper would need to assess his stock. The wine in the dolia would need to be checked. Was there enough for the anticipated business, or did new wine need to be brought from storage? The storage area might be in a back room, or in a cellar if the building had one. Bringing up amphorae of wine would require physical strength, as a full amphora could weigh 50 pounds or more. The wine would need to be poured from the amphorae into the dolia embedded in the counter. This transfer required care to avoid spilling, as wine was valuable and waste represented lost income. The keeper would tilt the amphora, allowing wine to flow through its narrow neck into a funnel or directly into the dolium. The process would be slow, and for refilling multiple dolia, it would be tedious. The keeper would also need to ensure he had adequate supplies of water, cups, and any food items he planned to sell. Water came from the nearest public fountain, or from a well if the building had one. Fetching water meant carrying heavy jugs or buckets from the source to the tavern. Multiple trips might be necessary to fill the water dolium sufficiently. Cups would need to be organized and accessible. If cups had been used the previous day and then left scattered about, they would need to be collected, rinsed, and placed where they could be easily reached during business. The rinsing process was simple. Dip the cup in water, shake out the excess, set it aside. This was not thorough cleaning but was considered adequate. If the tavern served food, additional preparation would be required. Bread would need to be purchased from a baker, or baked on premises if the keeper had the facilities and inclination. Other food items would need to be prepared or at least made ready for sale. A pot of stew, for example, would need to be started in the morning to be ready for serving in the evening. This meant sorting and cleaning legumes, adding water and flavourings, and setting the pot to cook over a brazier or small fire. As customers began arriving in the evening, the keeper's work shifted from preparation to service. He would need to divide his attention among multiple tasks simultaneously, pouring wine for customers, collecting payment, monitoring the behaviour of patrons, managing any employees or slaves who worked in the tavern, and maintaining awareness of everything happening in the establishment, all required constant attention. The financial management of the tavern was entirely the keeper's responsibility. He would need to track income and expenses mentally or through simple record keeping. The money received from customers would accumulate during the evening. This money would be kept in a box or container, presumably in a location that was secure but accessible. The keeper would need to ensure that the money was not stolen by patrons or by employees. At the end of each day, the keeper would need to count his takings and assess whether the day had been profitable. He would need to set aside money for purchasing wine and supplies for the next day. He would need to pay rent to the building owner if he did not own the premises himself. He might need to pay wages to any employees. What remained after these expenses was his profit, which needed to be sufficient to support himself and his family. The social dynamics of dealing with customers required skill and judgment. The keeper needed to be friendly enough to encourage customers to spend time and money in his establishment, but not so familiar that customers felt they could take advantage. He needed to cut off customers who had drunk too much and were becoming problematic, but doing so risked losing their future business or provoking angry confrontations. He needed to collect payment for drinks and food, which required trusting that customers would pay, but also being alert for those who might try to leave without paying. Dealing with drunk customers was a regular challenge. As patrons became intoxicated, they became louder, more careless, more likely to break things, and more likely to cause problems. The keeper might need to tell a customer to quiet down, to stop bothering other patrons, or to settle a dispute before it became violent. Most customers would comply with these instructions, respecting the keeper's authority in his own establishment, but some would be belligerent, requiring firmer intervention. In extreme cases, the keeper might need to physically eject a problem customer. This could be risky, as the customer might resist or retaliate. The keeper might enlist other patrons to help, regular customers who respected the keeper and wanted to maintain the tavern as a place where they could drink in relative peace. Together they would escort the disruptive person to the door and push him out into the street, making clear that he was not welcome to return that evening. The keeper also had to navigate legal and regulatory requirements. Taverns were subject to various local regulations about hours of operation, taxation, and acceptable behaviour. Officials might visit to ensure compliance or to collect taxes. The keeper would need to maintain relationships with these officials, which might involve small bribes or other forms of unofficial cooperation. The Roman bureaucracy at all levels operated partly through formal rules and partly through informal relationships and accommodations. The keeper's family members, if he had them, might work in the tavern as well. A wife might help serve customers, manage food preparation, or clean. Children might run errands, fetch water, or perform other simple tasks. This family labour reduced the need to pay employees and kept money within the household. However, it also meant that the family's living space and workspace were likely closely connected, with limited separation between domestic life and business. The reputation of the tavern was important for business. If the tavern became known as a place where wine was watered down too much, where customers were regularly cheated, where fights frequently broke out, or where the atmosphere was unpleasant, customers would go elsewhere. Conversely, a reputation for fair dealing, decent wine and a reasonably convivial atmosphere would attract repeat customers and word-of-mouth recommendations. The keeper's own character and management style would significantly influence the tavern's atmosphere. A keeper who was jovial and engaging might create a more lively social environment. One who was taciturn and focused purely on transactions might run a quieter, less social establishment. The keeper's willingness to extend credit to known customers, to tolerate rowdy behaviour, to allow gambling or prostitution on the premises, all these choices would shape the tavern's character and clientele. The long-term viability of a tavern depended on steady business. The keeper needed enough customers to generate income that exceeded his costs. In a competitive market where multiple taverns might serve the same neighbourhood, attracting and retaining customers was essential. Location mattered. A tavern on a busy street or near a forum or baths would have more potential customers than one in a quiet residential area. But even a well-located tavern needed to be managed effectively to succeed. Some tavern keepers were also involved in other businesses. The tavern might be one component of a larger operation that included wine production, property rental, or other commercial activities. For others, the tavern was their sole livelihood, and its success or failure directly determined their economic well-being. The uncertainty and variability of income from a tavern, busy days and slow days, profitable months and lean months, meant that the keeper lived with financial insecurity as a constant reality. Chapter 12. The Physical Structure and Design. The physical characteristics of Roman taverns reveal much about their function and the constraints under which they operated. These were not purpose-built structures in most cases, but were adapted spaces within buildings designed primarily for other purposes. Understanding the physical layout and features helped illuminate the experience of being in these spaces. The typical location was the ground floor of an apartment building or insula. These buildings were common in Roman cities, where population density required multi-story construction. The ground floor would be divided into multiple commercial spaces opening onto the street. A tavern might occupy one of these spaces, with residential apartments on the floors above. This arrangement meant that the tavern was integrated into the residential fabric of the neighbourhood, rather than being isolated in a commercial district. The dimensions of tavern spaces were modest. Most were probably no larger than 10 to 15 feet wide by 15 to 20 feet deep. This limited space needed to accommodate the counter with dolia, some seating or standing room for customers, and a minimal amount of circulation space. The small size meant that even with relatively few customers, perhaps 15 to 20 people, the space would feel crowded and full. The counter was the most important structural feature. It was typically built of masonry, brick or stone, and faced with marble or decorative tile if the keeper could afford it, or left as plain masonry if not. The counter formed an L shape or U shape that projected into the room from the back wall. The dolia were circular pottery vessels about 2 to 3 feet in diameter and 2 to 3 feet deep. embedded into the counter so that their tops were level with the counter surface. The number of dolia varied, but was typically between 3 and 6. Each dolium might contain a different type of wine or different beverage: red wine, white wine, water, and possibly others. The dolia needed to be accessible to the keeper from behind the counter, which meant the counter depth had to be sufficient to accommodate the dolium diameter. The keeper would stand in the space behind the counter, moving along its length to access different dolia and to serve different customers. Counter height was probably similar to modern bar heights, roughly waist high to the keeper and customers, allowing customers to lean comfortably while drinking. The counter surface, besides providing a place for customers to lean, served as a workspace for the keeper. He would set cups on it when filling them, place money on it when making change, and use it for various other small tasks during service. Behind the counter, the wall would typically have shelves. These shelves held additional cups, serving implements, and possibly decorative items or storage containers. The shelves were within easy reach of the keeper, so he could grab items as needed without stepping away from his serving position. The area behind the counter was the keeper's domain. Customers did not enter this space, which was separated from the customer area by the counter itself. The customer area included whatever space remained in the room. If tables and stools were present, they would be arranged to leave narrow paths for circulation between them. The tables were small, perhaps 2 feet square, and simple in construction. The stools were backless and minimal, offering a place to sit but no comfort. The arrangement would be casual rather than geometric, tables placed where they fit rather than in neat rows. The walls, as mentioned earlier, were plastered and sometimes painted. The plaster served both decorative and functional purposes. It covered the rough masonry or brick of the wall structure and provided a smooth surface. Paint, when present, brightened the space somewhat, though in the dim lighting colours would not be as vibrant as they would appear in daylight. The lower portions of walls would show more wear, scuffs from feet and furniture, stains from spilled drinks, scratches and carved graffiti. The ceiling height was probably 8 to 10 feet, standard for Roman construction. The ceiling itself might be a simple flat surface, the underside of the floor above, or might have wooden beams visible if the structure was timber framed. The ceiling would show soot accumulation from lamp smoke, darkening over time despite any cleaning efforts. In some taverns, decorative elements might hang from the ceiling, garlands during festivals, lamps on chains, or other items. Lighting fixtures would be positioned strategically around the space. Oil lamps might sit on the counter, on shelves, on tables, and in wall-mounted holders. The number of lamps depended on how well lit the keeper wanted the space to be and what he could afford in terms of oil consumption. More lamps meant better visibility but higher operating costs. Most taverns probably aimed for adequate but not lavish lighting. Ventilation was through the open front of the establishment, and any windows or vents to the rear or sides. The front would remain open during business hours, allowing air circulation and allowing the interior to be visible from the street. This openness served multiple functions. It let fresh air in, it let light in, it allowed potential customers to see that the tavern was open and had customers, and it allowed the sound and smell of the tavern to attract passers-by. The floor, as mentioned, would be of beaten earth, concrete, or tile. Drainage was not typically built in, so any spilled liquids would simply sit until they evaporated or soaked in, or were absorbed by sawdust or other material that might be spread on the floor. The accumulation of spills, dropped food, and general debris meant that floors would be dirty by modern standards, though this was normal and unremarkable in the context. Storage space was limited and was typically in a back room or cellar. The back room would hold amphorae of wine waiting to be used, supplies of cups and serving implements, food ingredients if the tavern served food, and the keeper's personal belongings. This room would be dark, accessible only to the keeper and his employees, and would be secured when the tavern was closed to prevent theft. Access to water was essential. If the tavern did not have a well on the premises, water would need to be fetched from the nearest public fountain. This meant that someone, the keeper, an employee, or a family member, would need to make regular trips carrying water containers. The labour involved in fetching water was significant enough that it affected tavern operations and costs. Waste disposal was rudimentary. Liquid waste might be thrown into the street. Solid waste, food scraps, broken pottery, other garbage, would be collected and disposed of in whatever manner was customary for the neighbourhood. There were no trash collection services in the modern sense, so waste would accumulate in streets and public dumps, contributing to the generally unsanitary conditions of Roman cities. Chapter 13. Seasonal and temporal variations. The experience of visiting a tavern varied significantly with the seasons and with the time of day, creating different atmospheres and different practical considerations for both keepers and customers. These variations were accepted as natural parts of the rhythm of urban life in the Roman world. In summer, the heat would be a dominant factor. Roman summers, particularly in southern Italy, could be very hot. The daytime temperature might reach 90 or even 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The evening would bring some relief as the sun set, but the temperature would remain warm well into the night. The stone buildings that filled Roman cities would retain heat absorbed during the day, radiating it back into the streets and interiors throughout the evening. A summer evening in a tavern would be uncomfortably warm once the space filled with customers. Each human body generated heat, and 20 or 30 bodies in a small space would raise the temperature noticeably. The lack of air conditioning or even effective natural cooling meant that the only relief was whatever breeze might enter through the open front of the establishment. Customers would sweat, making the smell of unwashed bodies more pronounced. They would drink more to compensate for fluid loss, which was good for the keeper's business, but could lead to more rapid intoxication. The wine served in summer might be cooler than room temperature if the keeper stored it in a cellar, where underground temperatures remained more moderate than surface temperatures. This cooler wine would be more refreshing and might command a slightly higher price for that reason. Some keepers might add snow or ice to wine if they could obtain it, though this was expensive and therefore reserved for wealthier customers or special occasions. Food in summer needed to be consumed relatively quickly, as the heat would cause it to spoil faster. A pot of stew left out for hours in summer heat would begin to smell and might make customers sick if consumed. Keepers needed to be more attentive to food freshness in summer, which might mean preparing smaller batches more frequently, or accepting more waste from food that could not be sold before it spoiled. The longer days of summer meant that evening business started later, as there was still daylight well into what would be considered evening hours. Customers might not arrive until an hour or more after sunset when the heat had diminished somewhat. The business period might extend later into the night as well, with customers willing to stay later when the alternative was returning to hot, stuffy homes. In winter, the opposite challenges prevailed. Roman winters, while mild by northern European standards, still brought cold temperatures, rain and wind. Evening temperatures might drop to 40 degrees Fahrenheit or lower. The cold would be more penetrating in the absence of effective heating and insulating clothing. The stone buildings that were cool in summer became cold in winter, absorbing and retaining the chill. A winter evening in a tavern would be cold when the establishment first opened, but would warm as customers arrived and their body heat raised the temperature. The keeper might maintain a brazier burning charcoal or wood to provide additional heat. This brazier would be a mixed blessing. It provided warmth, but also produced smoke, and consumed fuel that cost money. The smoke would make the air quality worse, adding to the general stuffiness of the crowded space. Wine in winter might be heated over the brazier. Warm wine was considered comforting and healthful in cold weather. The heating would be simple. Pour wine into a metal vessel and hold it over or near the heat until warmed. This heated wine might be mixed with spices or honey to create calda or mulsum, which commanded higher prices than plain wine and provided the keeper with better profit margins. The shorter days of winter meant that business hours would be compressed into the longer nights. Customers would arrive earlier, as there was little else to do after dark, and homes would be cold and dark as well. The tavern, with its lamps and relative warmth, would be an attractive alternative. However, the cold and rain might also keep some potential customers home, reducing overall business on particularly unpleasant evenings. Food in winter was less prone to rapid spoilage, allowing keepers to prepare larger batches that could be served over multiple days. Hot stew would be particularly appealing in cold weather, providing both nutrition and warmth. The steam from hot food would add moisture to the air and would contribute to the sensory environment of the tavern. The transition seasons of spring and fall provided more moderate conditions. Spring brought increasing warmth and longer days, creating a sense of renewal and optimism that might make customers more inclined to go out and socialize. The spring weather was variable, with periods of rain alternating with pleasant conditions. On nice spring evenings, the open front of the tavern would allow fresh air and the sounds and smells of the city to mix with the interior atmosphere. Fall brought cooling temperatures and the approach of winter. The harvest season meant that new wine would be coming to market, and taverns might feature newly pressed wine alongside older vintages. The quality and flavour of the new wine would be a subject of discussion and evaluation by customers. Fall evenings would be comfortable in terms of temperature, neither hot nor cold, making it a pleasant time to be out. The time of evening also significantly affected the tavern experience. The first hour after sunset would find the tavern relatively quiet and calm. The few early customers would be settling in, ordering their first cups of wine, perhaps ordering food if they had not yet eaten dinner. The keeper would be unhurried, able to engage in brief conversations with these early patrons while attending to their needs. The middle hours of the evening, perhaps 2 to 3 hours after sunset, would be the busiest period. The tavern would be full or nearly full of customers. The noise level would be highest. The keeper would be moving constantly, serving customers as quickly as possible while trying to keep track of who had paid and who still owed money. The atmosphere would be most energetic and social during this period. The late evening hours would see gradual thinning of the crowd as customers left to go home. The keeper might begin cleaning up even while customers remained, collecting cups, wiping the counter, sweeping the floor around customers' feet. The remaining customers would be those who had nowhere else to be, or who were too drunk to make good decisions about leaving. The atmosphere would become more subdued as numbers diminished. The very latest hour before closing would find the keeper actively encouraging remaining customers to leave. He would announce that the tavern was closing, would stop serving new drinks, and would make clear through his demeanour that it was time to go. Most customers would comply without issue, gathering themselves and departing. Stubborn holdouts might need more direct encouragement, with the keeper literally ushering them toward the door. After the last customer left, the keeper would close up the establishment. This involved securing the premises, closing shutters or doors, ensuring that valuable items were stored safely, extinguishing most or all lamps. The keeper would count his takings from the evening, assess how business had been, and make mental notes about what needed to be done the next day. Then he would retire to his own living quarters, whether those were in the same building or nearby, to sleep before beginning the cycle again the next day. Conclusion: the mundane routine of Roman nightlife. And so we reach the end of this exhaustive, deliberately tedious exploration of what it was like to visit a Roman tavern at night. We've examined every conceivable aspect of this experience in painstaking detail: the decision to go out, the walk through streets, the arrival and entry, ordering drinks, observing other patrons, the sensory environment, food, games and entertainment, the progression of the evening, the departure, the tavern keeper's perspective, the physical structure of the space, and seasonal variations. What emerges from this comprehensive examination is a picture of profound ordinariness. Visiting a Roman tavern was not an exotic adventure or a historically significant event. It was an utterly routine activity that millions of people engaged in countless times. The experience varied in minor details from tavern to tavern and evening to evening, but the fundamental pattern remained consistent. Order wine, drink wine, perhaps eat something, perhaps talk with other patrons, eventually go home. Repeat the next week or the next evening. This ordinariness is precisely what makes the subject ideal for inducing sleep. There are no climactic moments in this narrative, no plot twists, no conflicts that build to resolution. Everything unfolds in predictable, familiar ways. The wine tastes as wine tastes. The conversations follow well-worn patterns. The evening progresses from beginning through middle to end in the same way every time. The mind, following this narrative, finds nothing to grab onto, nothing that demands attention or creates tension. The steady stream of mundane details flows past, each as unremarkable as the last, creating a perfect environment for the mind to disengage and drift towards sleep. The Roman tavern experience can be understood as part of broader patterns of social behaviour that transcended the specific Roman context. Humans in various cultures and historical periods have created spaces for communal drinking and socialising. The specific forms vary: the beverages consumed, the physical arrangements, the social norms governing behaviour, but the basic function remains constant. People gather to drink, to talk, to escape temporarily from the demands and constraints of work and family life. The Roman tavern was one expression of this universal human tendency. The social stratification visible in taverns reflected broader Roman society. Taverns were primarily spaces for the lower classes. The wealthy had private spaces where they could entertain guests and did not need to seek company or entertainment in public establishments. The very poor might not have money to spend on tavern wine. So the tavern clientele was drawn from the middle and lower middle segments of society. Skilled workers, craftsmen, small merchants, soldiers, and others who had some disposable income but were not wealthy. This class composition meant that taverns were spaces where people of roughly similar social standing interacted. There was some internal differentiation. A master craftsman might look down on a common labourer. A freedman might feel superior to a slave sent on an errand, but everyone present was below the social elite. This created a particular social dynamic where people could interact with relative equality, where formal social hierarchies that governed other contexts were somewhat relaxed. However, this relaxation was limited. Roman society was highly stratified, and these hierarchies did not disappear in the tavern. People still knew their places. The interaction patterns still reflected status differences. The appearance of equality was more about the absence of the higher social ranks than about true egalitarianism. The tavern was a space for common people, but common people was a broad category that included its own hierarchies. Gender segregation was another fundamental characteristic. Women's absence from taverns, except as workers or prostitutes, reflected broader Roman gender norms. Respectable women's social life was supposed to be conducted in domestic spaces or in specific public contexts like religious festivals. The tavern was defined as a male space, and this definition was so strong that it went largely unquestioned. The modern concept of social spaces where men and women mix freely did not exist in the Roman world. The economic function of taverns was significant even if individual transactions were small. The wine trade employed growers, processors, transporters and retailers. The pottery industry produced the amphorae for transport and the cups for serving. The construction trades built and maintained the buildings. The food suppliers provided bread, olive oil and other items. All of this economic activity was sustained by the routine purchases of ordinary people, spending a few coins on an evening's drinking. The archaeological preservation of taverns at sites like Pompeii and Herculaneum provides unusually detailed evidence about these establishments. The volcanic ash that buried these cities in 79 CE preserved structures and artifacts in remarkable detail. We can see the actual counters with their embedded dolia. We can read graffiti on walls. We can examine the cups and cooking vessels. We can walk through the spaces and understand their scale and arrangement. This archaeological evidence grounds our understanding in physical reality rather than just textual descriptions. However, the textual evidence, while less direct, provides different kinds of information. Literary references to taverns tell us how elite Romans viewed these establishments, with contempt and moral disapproval, seeing them as sites of vice and low behaviour. Legal texts mention regulations and disputes involving taverns, revealing how authorities tried to control these spaces. Occasional references in letters or other documents provide glimpses of actual practices and experiences, combining archaeological and textual evidence, along with comparative evidence from other pre-modern societies, allows us to reconstruct with reasonable confidence what the experience of visiting a Roman tavern was like. We cannot know every detail. We do not know exactly what people said in their conversations. We do not know individual emotions and experiences, but we can describe the general parameters and typical patterns. The continuity between Roman taverns and later drinking establishments is worth noting. Medieval alehouses, early modern inns, and modern bars all served similar functions. The specific details changed: the beverages, the food, the entertainment, the social norms, but the basic pattern of public drinking spaces remained. This continuity suggests that taverns and their equivalents fulfill persistent human needs for social interaction, for spaces outside home and work, for contexts where informal socializing can occur. The modern person reading this description might find much that is familiar. The basic experience of ordering a drink in a public establishment, standing or sitting while consuming it, engaging in casual conversation or observation of other patrons, eventually paying and leaving, these are recognizable behaviors. The modern bar experience differs in many details from the Roman tavern, but the fundamental pattern remains similar across more than 2,000 years. Yet there are also significant differences that mark the distance between Roman and modern experiences. The sensory environment was different. The smell of unwashed bodies, the dim lamplight, the lack of background music or other modern ambient noise. The social norms were different. The all-male clientele, the greater acceptance of drunkenness, the different standards of public behaviour. The economic context was different. The lower standard of living, the different relative costs of wine and food, the lack of alternative evening entertainment options. Understanding these differences helps us grasp how much has changed in daily life over the millennia. The basic human desire to socialize over drinks remains constant, but the context in which this desire is fulfilled has been transformed by technological change, economic development, and cultural evolution. The Roman tavern patron and the modern bar customer are engaged in similar activities but in profoundly different worlds. For the Roman patron, the evening at the tavern represented a small escape from daily routines and responsibilities. For a few hours he could leave behind his work, his family obligations, and his confined living space. He could drink, talk with others, and experience a sense of social connection and relaxation. This escape was modest and temporary. The next morning would bring return to ordinary life with all its demands, but it was valued nonetheless. The ritual quality of the experience, the regular repetition, the familiar patterns, the predictable progression, made it comforting. Knowing what to expect, knowing the patterns of behaviour, knowing the general character of the experience created a sense of security and control. The tavern was a known quantity, a familiar space where one could relax because everything was expected and normal. This ordinariness, this predictability, this thorough familiarity is what we have tried to capture in this exhaustive description. By examining every mundane detail, by describing the unremarkable aspects at length, by dwelling on the routine and repetitive elements, we have attempted to convey the actual character of the experience rather than romanticizing or dramatizing it. The goal has been to bore you with the truth, rather than to entertain you with embellishment. And now, having reached the true end of this exploration, having examined Roman tavern life from every conceivable angle, having described the experience in more detail than any Roman who actually visited taverns would have thought necessary or interesting, we can finally allow this narrative to conclude. The Roman taverns closed at night, the lamps were extinguished, the shutters were fastened, and the keepers went to sleep. Similarly, this narrative now closes its lamps of description extinguished, its shutters of analysis fastened, ready for you too to sleep. Sleep well, and may you dream of dim taverns filled with the murmur of Latin conversations, the smell of wine and lamp oil, the taste of acidic wine mixed with water, the warmth of crowded spaces, and the general atmosphere of unremarkable normalcy that characterize these establishments. May your mind, saturated with mundane details about ordinary Roman drinking behaviour, find no stimulus to remain alert and instead sink gratefully into unconsciousness. Good night, and may your rest be as deep and undisturbed as the sleep of a Roman tavern keeper after a long evening of serving wine to ordinary customers engaged in thoroughly unremarkable activities. Good night. And so we conclude this exhaustive, deliberately tedious exploration of what it was like to visit a Roman tavern at night. We have examined every mundane detail, from the decisions to go out, to the walk through streets, to ordering wine, to observing other patrons, to the sensory environment, to conversations and entertainment, to the progression of the evening, and finally to the departure and aftermath. What emerges from this examination is the fundamental ordinariness of the experience. Visiting a tavern was not an adventure or a notable event. It was a routine activity that millions of ordinary Romans engaged in countless times throughout their lives. The experience was familiar to the point of being unremarkable. The same taverns, the same wine, the same types of people, the same conversations, the same progression from sobriety to mild intoxication, the same walk home through dark streets. This ordinariness is precisely what makes the topic suitable for a sleep-inducing narrative. There is no drama here, no excitement, no events that demand attention or create suspense. Everything unfolds in predictable ways. The wine tastes as it always tastes. The conversations cover the same topics in the same ways. The evening follows the same arc from quiet beginning to crowded middle to gradual dispersal at the end. The Roman tavern was not a glamorous place. It was not clean or beautiful or refined. It smelled of wine, sweat, and lamp smoke. It was crowded and noisy. The wine was often mediocre. The food was simple and greasy. The company was ordinary working men with nothing particularly interesting to say. The entertainment was basic. Dice games, crude songs, rambling stories. Yet for all its lack of glamour, the tavern served important social functions. It provided a space for social interaction outside the home and workplace. In a society where most homes were small and offered little comfort, the tavern provided an alternative space to spend time. It allowed men to interact with a broader range of people thus they would encounter in their daily work. It provided a venue for the exchange of information and gossip that connected people to their community. It offered a structured context for drinking alcohol, which served various social and psychological functions even if these were not explicitly recognized. The tavern also served economic functions. It provided employment for tavern keepers and their assistants. It created demand for wine, creating a market for wine producers. It used pottery and other goods, supporting craftsmen. The spending that occurred in taverns moved money through the economy. The taxes collected on wine sales provided revenue for the state. These economic functions were mundane but significant in the aggregate. From a historical perspective, Roman taverns are interesting because they were spaces where ordinary people spent time, and we know far less about ordinary people than about elites. The grand narratives of Roman history focus on emperors, generals, senators, and philosophers. But the majority of people lived ordinary lives that involved work, family, and small pleasures like visiting taverns. Understanding these ordinary experiences provides a more complete picture of Roman society. The archaeological evidence for Roman taverns is substantial. Excavated sites like Pompeii and Herculaneum preserve many tavern structures. The characteristic counter with embedded dolia, the arrangement of spaces, the wear patterns on floors, all provide physical evidence of how these establishments functioned. Wall paintings found in some taverns show scenes of tavern life. Graffiti scratched or painted on tavern walls records the names of patrons, crude jokes, declarations of love, and other ephemera of daily life. Literary sources provide additional information, though with limitations. Elite Roman writers mention taverns usually in critical contexts, as places of low moral character where respectable people should not go. These negative portrayals tell us that taverns existed and were frequented by common people, but they do not provide sympathetic or detailed descriptions of the actual experience. Legal sources mentioning regulations about taverns, disputes involving taverns, or crimes committed in taverns provide fragmentary information about tavern operation and culture. The continuation of tavern culture from ancient Rome through medieval Europe and into modern times demonstrates the persistence of this social institution. The specific details changed. The beverages served, the food offered, the games played, the social norms governing behaviour. But the basic function of the tavern as a public space for drinking and socialising has remained constant across centuries and cultures. As you drift towards sleep, perhaps imagine yourself in that Roman tavern. The dim lamplight, the smell of wine and bodies, the murmur of conversations in Latin around you, the taste of acidic wine mixed with water, the hard stool or standing position as you drink, the slow passage of time as the evening wears on, the gradual accumulation of tiredness and mild intoxication, the eventual decision to leave, the dark walk home, the simple bed waiting. These images and sensations, all quite ordinary and unremarkable, represent the lived experience of countless ordinary Romans. Their lives were not filled with dramatic events or historical significance. They worked, they ate simple food, they visited taverns, they slept. Day after day, year after year, generation after generation, the tavern was just one small part of this larger fabric of ordinary existence. And it is precisely this ordinariness, this lack of drama, this thorough familiarity and predictability that makes the topic ideal for inducing sleep. There is nothing here to create excitement or tension, no mysteries to solve, no conflicts to resolve, no surprises to anticipate. Just the slow, predictable unfolding of an evening at a Roman tavern, described in exhaustive detail, allowing your mind to relax into the steady rhythm of mundane activity until sleep claims you. Sleep well, and may you dream of dim taverns where nothing much happens, where wine is drunk slowly, where conversations meander without reaching conclusions, where time passes in an unremarkable blur, and where the most exciting event is deciding when to go home. Good night.